Mirrors by Greensearcher. Epilogue Part 1. Madame Professeur.
Whoa, slow down, Maurice, the king exclaimed. I'm afraid you lost me at evapotranspiration.
Maurice paused. A long metal tube held between his palms with several small holes screwed through its length.
Forgive me, your majesty, he said, clearing his throat. My wife has told me I tend to ramble in my excitement. Alexander only laughed. No apologies. I'm just glad I'm not the only one around here who gets excited about these gardens.
Maurice hummed pleasantly, looking back at the long row of roses. A similar metal tube to the one he had installed along the inner wall, a small trickle leaking into the soil.
I originally designed the irrigation system for our fields, though it proved a bit difficult to implement on such a scale, and I rarely had enough materials to make it work properly, he went on, falling back into his eager talk. It's a much simpler process among the gardens. It's genius, Alexander agreed. To think these ones took hours to water, but now it will take mere minutes.
He paused, thinking for a moment.
In fact, I would like to see this work for our farmers. Speak with Cogsworth. He'll get you anything you need to test the invention.
Maurice brightened. Thank you, your majesty. I'll start right away. He tucked the spare tube into his pocket, picking up a bag of peculiar tools and heading out back towards the castle. Alexander watched him go for a minute, then furrowed his brows.
Maurice,
he called out. The man paused, looking back.
Yes, my lord?
Alexander raised a hand to his chin.
What is it your wife does again? She works the fields, as I, Maurice said, and beyond that she provides our daughter's education.
Maurice raised his brows. He knew Maurice's young daughter was illiterate and obviously intelligent. Adam had been tutored by the best, and he now spent hours with his new friend poring over volumes in the library.
Belle was educated at home?
Yes, your majesty. I help where I can, but I admit, Soleil is far more suited to it.
I've often felt she had a gift for teaching. I thank God she does, for I don't know how we could have handled Belle's rapid need to learn without her.
Alexander frowned.
I know of the school teacher in Molyneux, he admitted. He is indeed breaking the law. Unfortunately, it is not an isolated problem in this kingdom. I've been investigating the issue for the past few weeks, and confirmed as much, he explained. I was initially tempted to force the hand of those responsible, but Jacqueline feared those girls attending school would feel the backlash from the instructors forced to teach them.
Maurice hummed, a dark look in his eyes. That could very well be true. Alexander stepped forward, lowering his voice.
So, I've been thinking that a more passive-aggressive approach may work best, he said quietly.
Maurice cocked his head, curious.
Would you bring your wife with you tomorrow? Alexander asked. I have a new experiment that I would like us to try.
24 boys ran outside of the schoolhouse, eager to play in the sunshine that had tempted them through the shutters all day. The old schoolmaster stood at the door, swatting those who idled with a long flat stick he kept in his belt. He was soon striding through the town himself, head held high, no little self-importance in his step as he passed the bakers and florists and mere farmers who hurried past. This town never changed, and he was one of the only among them who wasn't a poor, pathetic fool. Of course, he taught most of them himself. But if they didn't retain his lessons, that was their fault, not his. A violent rapping broke his focus, and he turned in irritation towards the noise. A half-built structure stood there, right at the edge of the town, settled near a beautiful creek and a small abandoned field now grown over with tall grass.
What is this?
He asked gruffly. The man who had been hammering away before turned then, wiping a sleeve against his brow before sliding down the tall ladder.
New school,
he replied, pouring a small canteen from his waist and taking a large gulp. The professor brightened. Perhaps this town could change for the better.
I knew it was only a matter of time before my efforts would be rewarded, he proclaimed.
The man replied, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly.
I think it is to be a school for girls, sir.
Heard Madame Dupont's setting up to teach him this fall. The professor froze. Then, slowly, angry red brightened his cheeks.
Who is responsible for this?
He spat.
I was not consulted.
Heard it was a royal order, the man said, simply shrugging.
Don't know much. They're just paying me to build the place. The professor paled. A royal order? I took the job eagerly, to be sure, the man continued. My young girl, Michelle, is set to start this fall with the others. She ain't talked of nothing else for weeks now. He paused, brightening again, and pulling the hammer back from his waist. Better get back to her, then. The professor watched as he climbed the ladder once more, fuming. Soleil Dupont. A teacher? Ha! He barked after a moment. Like that will last. School for girls. Ridiculous. He muttered, turning away and convincing himself that it wouldn't last a fortnight before they turned the school over to him and sent those foolish girls back home where they belonged. A loud cheer rang out from the new schoolhouse. The girls were split in two groups. The benches pushed away as two of them raced to the board to complete a line of arithmetic, before sprinting back and passing the chalk to the next teammate in line. Belle was now at the board, quickly penning in her answer before passing the small piece of chalk to one of the triplets. They cheered for her, chattering happily together as another student raced to the board. Belle went to the palace several days a week with her father, both to attend lessons with the young prince and receive her own tutoring from the master artist. Soleil's lessons were far too simple for Belle by now, but she still came often enough to enjoy the company of her friends. Something had happened to Belle these last few months. She had come out of her shell, it seemed, suddenly befriending everyone she met. Perhaps the young prince had something to do with it, the two of them playing happily with the other children in town when he came by. Soleil didn't know for sure, but she was glad for it, as, strangely, as the change had come about. She continued monitoring the game, smiling quietly at her students' glee. She discovered quite quickly that keeping the children moving, particularly the little ones, seemed to keep their brains moving as well, and she found great joy herself as their teacher. For while teaching Belle had been more than fulfilling, this gave her so much more freedom and variety in what she could do, and who she could help. Of course, she had been terribly anxious when the king had first made the proposal. After all, she had no formal training herself. Shouldn't they find someone better suited to the task? But now, well, she had to admit it felt something like a calling. The girls grew quiet then, breaking Soleil from her reverie. She turned to see what had caught their attention, and saw one of the village's littlest boys standing at the door, shifting nervously. He caught her eyes, and then swallowed. Professor? He said timidly. Madame Dupont is just fine, Benjamin. Soleil smiled. How can I help you? Madame? He paused, looking around nervously at the girls, who were now whispering amongst themselves. Then he sucked in a breath, practically blurting out the next line. Can I be in your class instead? Soleil blinked. Oh, has your professor sent you? He shook his head. No, I heard your class was more fun, he admitted. Please, I'll be real good, I promise. It's only for girls, one of her students proclaimed, hands on her hips. Soleil blinked, glancing around the room. She caught Belle's eyes, remembering the day she herself had been sent home from school. He said it's only for boys, Belle had said, holding back tears and grasping an injured hand. Frowning, Soleil turned to her class. Now, just a moment, she said carefully. I believe that anyone who wishes to learn should be welcome here. Do we all agree? The students watched her for a moment thinking. Then slowly they nodded, one by one, in agreement. Then let's return to our seats, she went on, then turned back to the boy. Come along, Benjamin. You can sit beside your sister today. He smiled wide, nodding eagerly and running over to help the others return the benches to their places. He sat happily between the others, legs swinging over the side, and gazed intent as he put his very best behaviour for the rest of the day. A week later, 2 more boys turned up at the schoolhouse door, just as class began. However, these were accompanied by their mother. My daughter is already reading full sentences, the mother said adamantly, yet these 2 have been attending school for 2 years and can barely spell their own names. Won't you take them, Soleil? And she did. In fact, by Michaelmas, the new schoolhouse was already overflowing with new additions. Maurice found it all wildly amusing, beaming in pride as he spoke of Soleil's success to his neighbours, and how the old professor had gotten what he deserved.
Soleil herself continued her work with a quiet dedication, finally feeling like she was living the life she was meant to live.
Belle, will you be going with Papa today?
Belle said happily, gathering her things in her satchel before pulling on her boots. Master Pascal is going to start teaching me oils today.
Oh, wonderful, Soleil said, picking up her plate from breakfast. Be sure to wear your frock though, dear. I'd rather you not ruin your...
She paused, a sudden nausea sweeping over her at the sight of hardened eggs on their plates. She swallowed, but the sensation only grew worse. Setting the plates down with shaky hands, she moved quickly out of the front door before her own breakfast found its way back out and in the dirt. "Maman!" Belle cried, racing down the steps after her. "Maman, what's wrong?" Soleil couldn't reply right away, letting the sick feeling take its course before setting back on the front steps. Belle had her hands on her arm, eyes frantic and close to tears. "Maman, please, you can't be sick," she said, voice shaking. "You can't." Then Soleil thought for a moment. Then, at once, the meaning of what was happening became clear, for there had been other signs over the past fortnight. This only settled it.
"Belle, don't worry," she said, turning to her. "This has happened to me before."
Belle looked even more upset at that.
I know, she whispered, starting to tremble.
Soleil cocked her head, wrapping an arm around her daughter's shoulders.
"Belle, it happened because I was carrying you," she explained gently.
Belle froze, blinking for a minute. Then her mouth fell open, a smile pulling at her lips. Oh, I thought you were... She stopped again, eyes growing wide. "Maman, does this mean..."
"Yes," Soleil smiled, an excitement growing in her own chest. "That's what it means."
"But how?" Belle breathed, hands to her cheeks as she stared across the yard.
Belle, dear, I thought I had already explained this to you."
"Why didn't it happen last time?" Belle went on, as though not hearing her. "Oh, who cares? I have to tell Adam." She threw her arms around Soleil's neck, kissing her on the cheek before standing up and hurrying down to the cellar. "Papa, hurry!" Her voice rang out from below. "I'm going to be a sister!"
A loud bang came from the shop, like several precarious objects tumbling to the floor. And then Maurice's own voice rang out.
"You're going to be what?"
he said, voice more high-pitched than normal. "Soleil, what's going on?"
Happy ends. Belle and Adam sat at the long kitchen table side by side, sipping on warm herbal tea. His legs just had barely grown long enough to touch the floor, though Belle's still swung in the air beside them. Bits of snow clung to their hair, having spent the day running through the fresh blanket of white that covered the grounds. Belle held her infant sister in her arms, now while Adam made funny cooing noises. Belle giggled at him.
"Oh," he said, pouting. "Babies like that, don't they?"
"Yes," she admitted, "but I can still laugh at you for it." His cheeks went pink. He looked back down.
"You're supposed to be the one laughing, Eloise," he joked.
At that the baby finally smiled. Adam grinned right back, glancing between the two of them for a moment.
"She looks like you," he said at last. "You have the same dimples."
Belle blushed, smiling in spite of herself, and no doubt showing off those very dimples in her cheeks. Mrs. Potts came by then, refilling their tea. Belle reached out and took a sip of the sweet drink, humming as it warmed her head to toe. "Thank you, Mrs. Potts," she said happily.
"Oh, don't mention it, dear," the woman replied. "I'm just glad our prince has found such a lovely friend."
Belle smiled again, then glanced at Adam. He gave her a wink.
The door opened then.
A man stood on the threshold, buried beneath furs and covered in fresh snow. He shook it off, stumping the slush from his boots before stepping into the warmth of the kitchen. "Papa!" A little boy toddled over on short legs, bright blonde hair sticking up in all directions. In his clumsy haste, he ran straight into the edge of the table, knocking his head and falling flat on his bottom. "Jack!" Henry cried, racing over in a panic. Yet Jack merely blinked twice where he sat, looking up at his father as he approached and smiling once again. Henry let out a breath of relief, scooping up the boy and running a hand over his head to check the injury.
"Got a head of a brick, this one,"
he chuckled, moving back across the room. He sat at the far end of the table, sighing tiredly. The faint smile returned when Jack wrapped two small arms around his neck. Someone else crossed the room then, a tray of food in her hands. Sophie paused beside Henry, hesitating just a moment, before setting the dishes beside him. "We kept it warm," she said, smiling shyly. "Mrs. Potts said it might be a late day for you."
Henry looked at the steaming plates of food for a moment, then back to her. "Thank you,
Sophie," she said sweetly. "Been upstairs, just working down here last week."
He stared at her for a long moment, before coming to himself. "Thank you, Sophie," he said softly.
She turned, and he watched her go. A moment longer than normal, perhaps. Then looked quickly back at the warm supper before him. The parts of his face visible above the beard were starting to redden, a small smile flicking over his lips. Others began to trickle into the kitchen then, returning empty platters and plates as several maids began to wash them. Others began settling along the table, the quiet chatter of evening filling the room. "Me," Jack said then, fingers flexing out towards the small porcelain cup Sophie had left him.
"You want the teacup?"
Henry asked. Picking it up, he downed the tea quickly, letting the cup cool another moment before handing it to his son.
"Careful now."
Jack held it with surprising gentleness for one so small, turning it in his hands before looking back up at his father. "Me," he said again, holding the cup in front of Henry. "Chip!"
Henry furrowed his brows. "There's no Chip." He stopped, eyes growing wide, and he wasn't the only one. The room had grown still, every eye on the young boy. Across the room, Mrs. Potts stood in silence herself, staring at them. Then, ever so slowly, she turned, picking up the nearby teapot and holding it in quaking hands. Her face had grown pale. Belle and Adam, meanwhile, were staring at each other in shock. "Mrs. Potts?" Adam asked slowly. Mrs. Potts swayed on her feet for a moment, gripping the counter. Adam was up on his feet in a moment, and together he and Lumiere helped her to the nearest chair. One hand still gripping the old pot, her breath nearly gone, eyes unblinking and staring ahead as though she wasn't even there. "Mrs. Potts," Adam said again, reaching for her shoulder. "Do you remember?" Mrs. Potts slowly raised a hand to her heart. Oh my goodness," she gasped, finally looking up at them. "I'd thought them only dreams. But it really happened, didn't it?" Adam glanced back at Belle, then at Mrs. Potts once again. He slowly nodded, and in an instant, pandemonium. "You've dreamt it too? It was all real! How could we have forgotten?" Meanwhile, Mrs. Potts had thrown her arms around Adam and Belle, holding them tight and pecking them both with kisses. "Mrs. Potts!" Adam grimaced to no avail. Amid the excitement, however, Sophie was frozen in place. She stared back at Henry, who was now watching her with wide eyes. "Henry?" she whispered nervously. "Soph!" He was up in a heartbeat, crossing the crowded room in 3 giant strides and pulling her closer with one arm. Jack laughed from his other, small fingers reaching for one of Sophie's short curls. "What's going on here?" Cogsworth stood at the foot of the steps now, red-faced and out of breath. "Don't you remember, Cogsworth?" Sophie cried, breaking away from Henry's kisses and laughing as he planted a dozen more across her face. "All of it! How could we forget?" "Forget what?" Cogsworth huffed irritably, looking ruffled as he stared impatiently down at his pocket watch. "How you were all due upstairs a quarter of an hour ago?" "You were a clock, mon ami!" Lumiere cried, barely containing his laughter. "A little wooden mantel clock." "A clock? What are you talking about? I was no such—" Cogsworth suddenly stopped, growing pale as a sheet. Oh my," he finally gasped, reaching for the nearest chair. Someone fetched him a glass of water, the merriment around swelling as more members of the staff were drawn to the noise and told the news. "I've got the champagne," Lumiere declared, somehow already having retrieved 4 bottles from the wine cellar. That is for Christmas!" Cogsworth cried, recovering. Yet he was too late. 3 corks ricocheting off the ceiling as a dozen wine glasses were already being passed around the room. "This is far better than Christmas, Cogsworth!"
Lumiere said, slapping him on the shoulder. We had a victory to celebrate!
And we're getting married!
Henry cried from across the room, Sophie beaming at his side. The cheers grew threefold, wine flowing ever more rapidly. Upstairs, Belle and Adam's parents moved down through one of the great halls, unaware of the merriment far below as they spoke of current matters. You've done wonderful work in Molyneux already, the Queen was telling Belle's mother. That's why we asked you both here tonight, because we wish to ask if you wouldn't help us implement more schools like yours across the province. Soleil's eyes grew wide, surprised. She had expected they'd been asked here for Maurice's work, not her own. We realise with the new addition to your family, you may need some time, Jacqueline went on quickly, but we do hope you consider it in the meantime. Soleil started, but then stopped. She already knew her answer. Yes, I'll love to help. I'll help however I can, Your Majesty, she said firmly.
Excellent, the King replied. Now, we plan to take a similar approach in the other towns, but we need more teachers. We believe you are best suited to oversee their selection and instruction, given your own success in Molyneux.
Soleil blinked in shock. Was such a position really being offered to her? It may take you away from your own classes for a year or so, Jacqueline added, but it could do wonders for this kingdom's children. And you won't be doing this alone. We'll make sure you're well staffed, and I'm determined to help you myself in any way I can. Thank you, my queen, Soleil replied, still in awe at the offer.
Wonderful. Now, Maurice, the King said, I was thinking about your woodcutting invention the other day, and...
He stopped, voice eclipsed by raucous cheers from the floor below.
What in the world? He wondered.
Perplexed, the four of them made their way around the corner and down into the kitchens. As they neared the lower landing, they caught sight of what must have been every member of the household crammed into the open room, laughing and drinking, and in a few of the corner who had struck up their fiddles and began to play. Cogsworth sprinted up the final steps to meet them.
Your Majesty, I was against this from the start,
he stammered, breathless. He cast a hand towards Lumiere.
It was all his fault. I tried to stop them, but they wouldn't listen to me. No. Ah, the Blanca de Noir. Positive,
Alexander said, descending the final steps. A glass was quickly produced for him, and he took a hearty sip.
What's the occasion? He asked belatedly.
The room grew quiet once again, the laughter and melodious strings falling still. Lumiere stepped forward, sobering before he spoke. Our victory, Your Majesty, he said carefully, raising his glass, against the enchantress, your brother, and time itself. The King stared at him for a long moment.
Good God,
he breathed at last. Jacqueline stepped slowly beside her husband. She looked up at him, and then the others, her eyes finally falling on Adam, who had made his way to the front of the crowd. Her eyes grew wide. Oh, she gasped, running towards him and pulling him close. I have you back, she gasped, eyes already filling with tears. I will get to see you grow. Maman, it's all right, Adam insisted, reaching around her with still short arms in an effort to comfort her.
Don't cry.
Behind them, Soleil looked utterly bewildered as Maurice held her in his own teary embrace. Maurice, my love, whatever is wrong? She asked. He tried to answer, but could only make a sort of teary laugh, holding her even closer. Belle was already beside them, wrapping her arms around both and smiling warmly. Don't worry, Maman. I'll explain everything, she said happily. Soleil wasn't the only one without the full tale, for the others were still in the dark as to the enchantress's defeat. Eventually, Belle and Adam found themselves standing atop the kitchen table, relating the entire event to the household. Adam let Belle explain most of it herself. She had always been the better storyteller, after all.
But why did you not say anything until now, dear?
Madame de la Grande-Bouche asked as she finished. Belle glanced at Adam. He pursed his lips, looking back towards the others.
We didn't know if you'd believe us,
he said quietly, taking a step back to the floor. And, well, a lot of bad things happened. I was worried it might hurt you all more to remember. Someone stepped forward then. once a small salad plate in a rain gutter. Charlotte stood with courage at the front of the crowd. The others remained quiet, though several hands rested on her shoulders and arms as she spoke. "I do remember the hurt now," she confessed, looking down at Adam. Her eyes were quaking, but she went on. "But to remember the pain makes the present so much sweeter." Adam swallowed against a thick throat, vision blurring as she suddenly knelt before him. She reached for his hand, squeezing it in earnest, kissing it softly. "Thank you, my prince," she breathed, eyes wet. "You were able to save my life after all, it seems. I will make it count." The night wore on, though the tears and celebrations didn't relent. Giles leaned against a far corner of the room, watching the festivities with a bemused smile. "Giles," someone spoke. He looked down, where Belle's young, bright eyes watched him curiously. "You already remembered, didn't you?" she asked.
"Indeed. I've recalled it all for some time now,"
he admitted.
"One does not forget a near-death experience so easily."
Adam approached then, looking happy but relieved to escape the embraces of the staff that had encased him in the last hour.
"As it turns out, I'm grateful you faced Cersei without me,"
he said seriously, turning to look at Adam. He looked between the two of them then. Children now, but at one time 2 very capable adults. Adults they would grow into once again. And not before long. He smiled.
"It seems you two managed to give everyone the happy ending that they deserved."
Then, resting a hand on each of their shoulders, he nodded before moving quietly towards the back door. Adam watched him go, thinking on those words. Everyone had truly gotten their lives back. All 10 years, and every person they had lost returned in full once again. Yet, as Adam watched the commander enter the cold night air alone, he realized Cersei's final spell hadn't gone back quite far enough to give everyone a happy ending.
"Belle?"
"Shh! Hold still!"
Belle!"
Belle ignored Adam's plea for the moment as another dozen songbirds alighted along his shoulders and arms. She had even caught sight of a bullfinch, its red crimson breast even brighter than its surrounding leaves, now alighting atop his head. Her fingers moved quickly, sketching the little bird in her notebook, making a mental note of the colour for later. Meanwhile, Adam remained crouched in the clearing, obediently holding out a large handful of seed, even as his expression grew slowly more and more concerned.
"Belle,"
he said again, glancing over at her,
"what if one,
defecates on me?" he whispered. She grinned. "Don't worry, I'm almost done." He swallowed, eyes the only part of him moving as he watched the swarm of creatures jump to and fro around his limbs. The one atop his head now ducked down, staring him in the eye.
"Hello, little prince,"
it chirped. Adam yelped, his arms flailing around, sending the rest of the flock scattering in all directions and chirping madly at him. And a moment later, the bullfinch spun in the air and transformed into a tiny old woman. "Nana!" Belle cried, dropping her notebook and running into her embrace.
"Hello, child."
Agatha smiled, hugging her back. Adam was currently on his backside amidst the leaves, looking dazed. He then sighed, smiling a little sheepishly before standing up and brushing himself off.
"You must forgive me, Prince Adam, but I could hardly help myself."
Agatha chuckled.
"And I've been tackling some new forms, you see. Must get in the practice where I can."
"What have you been doing lately?" Belle asked eagerly. "And did you only just remember what had happened?"
"Oh, no, I remember quite some time ago," she smiled. "And I've checked in on you two now and again, but until recently I've been quite busy tending to my gardens."
Adam cocked his head, curious, but she didn't elaborate.
"Now," she went on, "is there anything you need? You did free the Sword Enchantress after all, and I have yet to formally reward you."
"But Nana," Belle said in earnest, "you already helped us defeat Cersei and—"
Yes, but that doesn't count,"
Agatha said, waving off the excuse.
"Come now, what will it be? A trip to the Sahara? Or another enchanted mirror, perhaps?
Belle's eyes brightened at that, but they quickly faded. These things were for them, but they already had their happy ending. Something one person still didn't have. She glanced at Adam, who seemed to be thinking just what she was.
Actually, he said, looking back at Agatha, there is one thing you could do.
He was falling. Jean blinked, the blindness from his shock and pain fading, and the world around coming back into view, rushing past in a blur. He gasped, still falling. He looked up at the cliff above, already so far, heard his own name like a whisper on the wind. Giles! His heart thundered in his chest. He looked down, the ocean below reflecting the moonlight above like a round silver platter. He'd missed the rocks, it seemed. Not that it mattered, for water was as hard as bricks from such a height. It was coming close now, coming far too quickly. He tried to scream, but his throat had seemed to seal shut. All he could do was stare down at his own dark, approaching reflection in the waters below. I'm going to die, he thought wildly. Oh God, I'm going to! All went black, and then, slowly, he opened his eyes.
Roll him over, little prince.
Adam nodded, rolling the man over in the wet sand. He had emerged from the waves now, having come to the ocean's reflection from decades past. Adam breathed out, beads of sweat against his brow.
It worked!
When they had first proposed that they save Jean, Agatha had been surprisingly reluctant.
It's unwise to alter the past,
she explained, so they'd come up with a plan to save the man from his fate while only altering the future. Agatha didn't have any qualms with that. Adam slowly looked back at the man who was breathing shallowly behind them. He had a long, tangled grey hair streaked with bits of red, and wore an outdated military uniform. He groaned, grimacing where he lay, then coughed roughly and opened his eyes. He stared up at Adam, then over at Agatha's small form beside him, eyes growing wide.
Who are you?
We're friends, Adam said in earnest. Jean furrowed his brows, then shrugged, lying back on the dirt.
I feel terrible,
he said. Then he sighed, looking back at them again.
Damn, I wound up in hell, didn't I?
Agatha chuckled.
Not quite. Only aged some 40 years.
Jean stared at her now. He blinked once, looked back at Adam, and then blinked again.
What? You see, I've done something I wouldn't normally attempt, Agatha went on.
She grinned, looking at those who approached.
But it seems your Giles has some very convincing friends.
Jean sat up in an instant.
Giles?
He didn't have to look far, for Giles soon knelt at his side. Belle moved beside him, a hand on his arm. His face was as white as a sheet, as he stared at the man in the sand.
Jean, you're all right,
Giles finally said, sucking in a breath before swallowing roughly. He reached out to stable the man, though he shook far more than Jean did.
You're all right.
Jean stared at him for a long minute, then looked down at his hands, wrinkled like the man's who now held his arms tightly. He then looked up into the older man's face again, eyes growing wide.
My God, he breathed, then a smile. It is you. Yes, Giles replied hollowly. It's...
But he couldn't finish, for Jean had pulled him into a tight embrace, laughing.
I thought I was a dead man,
he cried, pulling back and staring down at himself.
What happened? Was I in a coma? Amnesia? How long has it been?
He stopped suddenly, reaching up and pulling off the shirt from his shoulder. His eyes grew wide.
I was shot, wasn't I? It's all healed up, and... Yes, yes, cried Agatha. Now slow down, young man, and let us explain.
Giles stared at that, letting an expression mixed with bewilderment and fascination as the old enchantress explained his situation. Giles, on the other hand, stared at the man he'd thought dead for 40 years. He turned away at times, hiding his face from the others but keeping a protective arm around Jean the whole time. When Agatha was done, she stood promptly, nodded, and guided Adam and Belle away, leaving the two older men sitting in the sand.
Giles,
Jean finally said, turning to look at him with wide eyes.
I hope you aren't,
Giles said quickly, but then he stopped before starting again.
She couldn't serve you then, only bring you here now. I thought you'd want more time, even if it meant...
He lowered his voice.
I'm old, Jean. You have no obligation to me. I just wanted you to have the chance to live, if just for...
I'm old too, aren't I? Jean said with amusement. At 60 or 20, it's still you, isn't it? In fact, damn, Giles, he went on, cocking his head at him, I think you may have grown even more handsome with age.
Giles blinked, cheeks suddenly bright as the setting sun.
Jean.
Come on, you've got to tell me everything that's happened,
he said in earnest.
Did you win the border war? Yes, we did.
I knew you would,
Jean exclaimed.
And Cecile, did she ever...
He trailed off, but Giles had moved a hand to cover his eyes. His shoulders were trembling. And so, wrapping still wide arms around him, Jean finally realized how long he'd really been gone.
What's that?
He asked carefully, some minutes having passed. A necklace had slipped from Giles's shirt, a round, faded locket hanging in the air. Giles reached down for it, flicking it open easily before displaying it in his palm. A lock of bright red hair. A lock Jean had cut himself what felt like a mere hour ago.
You kept it,
Jean realized in awe.
All this time?
And finally Giles smiled. A hard, aged smile, the experiences of a lifetime apparent in his features. Yet something was still there, something that hadn't changed at all.
So I always had a piece of you with me,
he explained, repeating Jean's own words back at him.
No matter how long we had to wait.
End of part 1. Hi guys, cutting this into I think about 3 parts because it's very long, and with this new app I'm using to make my videos, I found it better to not do hour-long chapters anymore. So yeah, what a beautiful beginning to the new timeline, don't you think? I mean, all of that. Soleil becoming a teacher and the boys slowly filtering in until, because she's just better. I love that. And I love that Belle's parents and Adam's parents become good friends. And Soleil is back as well. Like, Belle's got a baby sister. And then, I love that it's Chip who helps everyone remember. And I like that Henry and Sophie met again before that and they're both still blushing over each other. But then as soon as they've got their memories back, Henry's, we're getting married! Yes. And Lumiere bringing out the champagne. Why am I not surprised? Yeah, I absolutely adore this epilogue. So I'll see you guys in part 2, okay? Have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you're in. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And remember to take care, my guys, gals, and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video, okay? Bye!